A woman steps off a train in the wild Montana territory, believing she's about to marry the rancher who wrote her months of tender letters, only to find a young cowboy waiting on the platform with devastating news. The man she came for is dead. Stranded, broke, and furious, she's offered an impossible choice by the stranger who helped write those letters. Marry him instead to save a failing ranch, or go back to nothing. This is a story of deception, desperate choices, and two broken people building something real from the wreckage of broken promises. Follow this story to the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The train lurched to a stop with a hiss of steam and the groan of metal against metal, and Clara Wren pressed her gloved hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Beyond it, Copper Ridge Station sat like a bruise against the Montana landscape, a cluster of weathered buildings, a water tower, and a handful of people scattered across the platform like seeds thrown onto hard ground. She'd imagined this moment 100 times, 1,000 maybe. The older rancher stepping forward with kind eyes and a worn hat, his hand extended, his voice steady. Samuel Whitlock, 52 years old, a man who'd written her letters that felt like safety, like the first deep breath after years of holding still. But as the conductor called out the station name and passengers began gathering their things, Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not excitement, not relief. Something closer to dread. She shook it off. Exhaustion, that's all. 3 days on a train would shake anyone's nerves. Clara stood, smoothing the front of her brown traveling dress. It wasn't new, but it was clean, carefully mended at the seams. She'd left St. Louis with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and $17 she couldn't afford to spend. Everything she owned was either on this train or already gone. The aisle was narrow, crowded with men in dusty coats and women clutching children. Clara waited her turn, hands folded, eyes forward. She'd learned a long time ago not to draw attention, not to take up space unless she had to. When she finally stepped onto the platform, the wind hit her like a slap, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of sagebrush and something else, smoke maybe, or dust from the rails. She blinked against it, scanning the faces. No one moved toward her. Clara's stomach dropped. She set her carpet bag down and turned slowly, taking in the platform again. A family reunion happening near the freight car. A man in a suit checking his pocket watch. 2 ranch hands loading crates onto a wagon. And then, there, at the far end of the platform, leaning against a post like he wasn't sure he wanted to be seen. A young man, lean, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at her, but he wasn't looking away either. Clara's pulse kicked up. She told herself to stay calm. Samuel had mentioned workers. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe Samuel was late, and he'd sent someone ahead. She picked up her bag and walked toward him, her boots loud against the wooden planks. He straightened when she got close, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. Young, yes. Tired, definitely. There were lines around his eyes that didn't belong on someone his age, and his jaw was tight, like he was bracing for something. "Excuse me," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "I'm looking for Samuel Whitlock. Do you know him?" The young man's throat worked. He took off his hat, turned it over in his hands. "Yes, ma'am." Relief flooded through her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Oh, thank goodness. Did he send you to meet me? I'm Clara Wren. I'm sure he mentioned, I know who you are." The way he said it made her stop. Not rude exactly, but not welcoming either. Clara frowned. "Then, is he here? Or is he waiting at the ranch?" The young man looked down at his hat. His knuckles were white where he gripped the brim. "Ma'am, He trailed off, then seemed to force himself to meet her eyes. Samuel Whitlock passed away. 2 months ago. The world tilted. Clara heard the words, but they didn't land right. They hovered somewhere outside her, like they belonged to someone else's story. "What? I'm sorry," he said quietly. I should have written to you sooner. I didn't know how." Her carpetbag slipped from her hand and hit the platform with a dull thud. She didn't pick it up. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the man I came here to marry is dead?" "Yes, ma'am." 2 months ago. "Yes." "And you didn't think to inform me?" His jaw tightened. "No, ma'am, I didn't." Clara stared at him. The wind whipped at her skirts, pulled strands of hair loose from her bun. Around them, the platform was emptying. The train was already starting to pull away, steam rising in white plumes. She felt something building in her chest. Not tears, she was past tears. This was something hotter, sharper. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ethan Whitlock, Samuel's nephew. And you let me get on a train and travel 1,500 miles to marry a dead man." "I didn't let you do anything," Ethan said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if you'd even believe me if I wrote it down." "So you said nothing." "So I said nothing." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to collapse right there on the platform and let the wind carry her away like the dust. But she did none of those things. She stood there, back straight, hands clenched at her sides, and tried to think. She had $17. No return ticket, no family to wire for help. The landlady in St. Louis had already rented out her room. She was stranded. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. "If you're not here to meet me as Samuel's, as his representative, then why are you standing on this platform?" Ethan put his hat back on, tugged it low. "Because I owe you an explanation." "You owe me more than that." "I know." He picked up her carpet bag, and Clara almost snatched it back out of reflex. But she didn't. She just watched him, trying to figure out what kind of man stood in front of her. "There's a hotel in town," Ethan said. "Not much, but it's clean. I'll pay for a room. You can rest, and we can talk tomorrow. Figure out what comes next." "What comes next?" Claire repeated. Her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Yeah." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at the town beyond the station. Copper Ridge wasn't much. A main street, a few cross streets, buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry and never improved. It was nothing like St. Louis, nothing like anywhere she'd ever been. And she had nowhere else to go. "Fine," Clara said. "One night, then I'm getting on the next train east and you're going to pay for the ticket." Ethan nodded. "Fair enough." He turned and started walking, and after a moment, Clara followed. Books. The hotel was called the Ridgeline, and it was exactly as advertised, clean, but not much else. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions, just handed over a key and pointed toward the stairs. Ethan carried Clara's trunks up to the second floor, set them down outside her door, and stepped back. "I'll come by in the morning," he said. 8 o'clock. We'll talk then." Clara nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything else. He tipped his hat and left, his boots heavy on the stairs. Inside the room, Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the wall. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner. The window overlooked the street, where a few people moved in and out of the general store. She thought about Samuel's letters, the careful handwriting, the way he'd described the ranch, the mountains, the life they'd build together. He'd been honest about his age, about the work, about what he could and couldn't offer. He'd never promised love, but he'd promised stability, respect, a place to belong. And now he was gone. Clara pulled one of the letters from her pocket. She'd kept a few, folded and refolded until the creases were soft. She read it again, even though she had it memorized. "I know this isn't a romantic arrangement, but I believe we could be good partners. You've known hardship, and so have I. Maybe that's enough to build something honest." Her throat tightened. She folded the letter, put it back in her pocket, and lay down on the bed fully dressed. She didn't cry. She just stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what the hell she was going to do. Right. Ethan was waiting outside the hotel at 8 the next morning, leaning against a post with his arms crossed. He straightened when Clara stepped outside, her carpet bag in hand. "Morning," he said. "Morning. There's a cafe down the street. Thought we could talk over breakfast." Clara didn't argue. She was hungry, and if he was paying, she wasn't going to turn it down. The cafe was small, just a handful of tables, and a counter where a woman in an apron was flipping eggs on a griddle. They sat by the window and Ethan ordered coffee and biscuits for both of them. When the food came, Clara ate in silence. Ethan watched her, then looked away, then looked back. "I know you're angry," he said finally. "That's an understatement. I don't blame you." Clara set down her fork. "Why didn't you write to me?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I didn't know what to say. Samuel died sudden. Heart gave out while he was mending fence. By the time I thought about writing to you, it had already been a few weeks, and I figured, I don't know. I figured maybe it was better to just let it go. Let you think he'd changed his mind or something. Better for who? For you, maybe. I don't know. He rubbed a hand over his face. I'm not good at this. At any of this. Clara studied him. He looked like he hadn't slept. There was a stubble on his jaw, and his shirt was wrinkled, like he'd pulled it on in a hurry. You helped write the letters, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan's head snapped up. What? The letters. Samuel's handwriting was shaky in some of them. Yours isn't, but the voice changed just a little in a few spots. Younger phrasing, different rhythm. She leaned back in her chair. You helped him, didn't you? Ethan stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, his hands weren't good toward the end. Arthritis. He'd tell me what to write, and I'd put it down. Sometimes I'd add a line or two if he got stuck. So the man I was writing to wasn't even one person. It was still him, Ethan said, and there was heat in his voice now. It was his thoughts. His life. I just helped get it on paper. Clara looked away. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. Why did he want a wife, she asked. If he was that sick, why go through all this? He wasn't sick, not like that. He was lonely. The ranch was falling apart, and he didn't have anyone. He thought maybe if he found someone steady, someone who wanted a real life, it'd give him a reason to keep going. Ethan's voice dropped. He talked about you all the time, after the letters started. He was happy. I think you gave him something to look forward to. Clara felt a pang in her chest, sharp and unexpected. And now? She asked. Now the ranch is still falling apart. I'm trying to hold it together, but I don't know if I can. That's not my problem. I know. They sat in silence. Clara finished her coffee. Ethan didn't touch his. There's a train east tomorrow afternoon, Clara said. I'll be on it. Ethan nodded. I'll get you a ticket. She stood, and he stood with her. But before she could walk away, he said, Wait. Clara turned. Ethan looked like he was fighting with himself. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Finally, he said, If you wanted to stay, just for a few days, just to see the place, I wouldn't stop you. Why would I do that? Because Samuel wanted you to see it, and because, I don't know, maybe it'd give you something, closure, or whatever. Clara shook her head. I don't need closure. I need a train ticket and a plan. Fair enough. She left the cafe and walked back toward the hotel, her mind already turning over what came next. St. Louis was out. She'd have to find work somewhere else. Maybe further west. Maybe... Miss Wren. She stopped and turned. Ethan was standing in the doorway of the cafe, hat in his hands. If you change your mind, he said, the ranch is 6 miles north, Silver Creek Valley. Anyone in town can point you the right way. Clara didn't answer. She just turned and kept walking. Boati. She spent the rest of the day in her room, going through her options. They were few and grim. By evening, she'd come to a decision. She'd take the train as far as her money would get her, find work in whatever town she landed in, and start over. Again. It wasn't a good plan, but it was a plan. She was packing her trunks when someone knocked on the door. Clara opened it to find Ethan standing there, looking even more exhausted than before. I need to talk to you, he said. I don't have anything to say. Please. Something in his voice made her pause. She stepped back and let him in. Ethan didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the small room, turning his hat over in his hands, and Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set like he was bracing for a blow. I lied, he said. Clara crossed her arms. About what? About why I didn't write to you. He looked up, met her eyes. I mean, part of it's true. I didn't know what to say. But the real reason is, I needed you to come. The air seemed to leave the room. What? The ranch is failing, Ethan said, the words coming faster now. We're 3 months behind on the bank loan. The crew's down to 2 men, and they're both talking about leaving. I've been trying to hold it together, but I can't do it alone. Samuel knew that. That's why he wanted a partner. Someone steady. Someone who could help him save the place. Clara's voice was ice. So you let me come here under false pretenses so you could, what, trick me into saving your ranch? No. Not trick. I thought maybe if you saw the place, if you understood what it could be, you might want to stay. You thought wrong. I know. Ethan's voice cracked. I know. But I'm asking anyway. Stay, just for a month. Help me figure this out. If it doesn't work, I'll pay for your ticket east and give you enough to start over somewhere. But if it does, if we can pull this off, you'd have a share. A real share. 50-50. Clara stared at him. You're out of your mind. Probably. I don't know you. I don't know anything about ranching, and I'm not going to throw my life away on a failing piece of land in the middle of nowhere. I'm not asking you to throw your life away, Ethan said quietly. I'm asking you to take a chance. Same way you did when you got on that train. Clara wanted to say no. She wanted to throw him out and lock the door and never think about Silver Creek Valley Ranch again. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not pleading exactly, but honest. Like he knew how insane this sounded and was asking anyway. Or maybe it was the fact that she didn't have anywhere else to go. Not really. 1 month, she heard herself say. Ethan blinked. What? 1 month. I'll stay for 1 month. You pay for my room and board, and at the end of it, you give me $200 and a ticket to anywhere I want to go. And if I decide to leave before that, the deal's off and you owe me nothing. Deal, Ethan said immediately. Clara shook her head. You didn't even think about it. Didn't need to. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to figure out if she'd just made the smartest decision of her life or the dumbest. When do we leave? She asked. First light. They left Copper Ridge at dawn, the wagon rattling over the rough road that led north into the hills. Clara sat beside Ethan on the bench, her trunk secured in the back, and watched the landscape unfold around her. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Rolling hills covered in dry grass, stands of pine in the distance, and beyond that, the mountains, gray and jagged against the pale sky. Ethan didn't talk much. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins. Clara didn't push. She was too busy trying to keep her nerves in check. After about an hour, the road dipped into a valley, and Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of a rise. There, he said, pointing. Clara followed his gaze. Below them, nestled in the curve of a creek, was the ranch. A main house, a barn, a few outbuildings. Fences that needed mending, fields that looked like they hadn't been worked in months. It was small, rough, nothing like the picture Samuel had painted in his letters. But it was something. Silver Creek Valley Ranch, Ethan said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She just stared at the place that might become her home. And for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something other than anger or fear. She felt possibility. The wagon rolled down the slope, and with each turn of the wheels, Clara felt the weight of her decision settling heavier on her shoulders. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, and tried not to think about what she'd just agreed to. 1 month, 30 days. It wasn't forever. The ranch grew larger as they approached, and the flaws became clearer. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, wire sagging between them. The house itself looked solid enough, but the paint was peeling, and one of the shutters was missing entirely. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. It needs work, he said finally. That's one way to put it. He climbed down and came around to help her, but Clara was already on the ground, brushing dust from her skirt. She walked toward the house slowly, taking it in. The porch steps creaked under her weight. The front door stuck when Ethan pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cool. The main room was bigger than she'd expected. A stone fireplace on one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs, shelves lined with tin plates and cups. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Samuel's room is upstairs, Ethan said, standing in the doorway. You can take that one. I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse with the crew. Clara turned. There's a crew? 2 men, Hank and Eli. They've been here longer than I have. And they're staying? For now? Clara walked to the window and looked out at the barn. A man was leading a horse across the yard, older, with a limp and a gray beard. He glanced toward the house, then went back to his work. That's Hank, Ethan said. Eli's probably out checking fence line. Clara nodded. She didn't know what else to say. Ethan carried her trunks upstairs, and Clara followed. The second floor was smaller, just 2 rooms and a narrow hallway. He pushed open the door to the larger room and set the trunks down. "I'll let you get settled," he said. "Come down when you're ready. We'll go over the books." "The books?" "Financial records. You said you wanted to know what you're getting into." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "I did, didn't I?" Ethan left and Clara closed the door behind him. She stood in the middle of the room, looking around. A bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a chair by the window. It was plain, worn, but it was clean, and it was hers, at least for the next month. She sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. Then she unpacked. An hour later, Clara came downstairs to find Ethan at the table, a stack of ledgers and papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the exhaustion in his face more clearly now, not just tired, but worn down, like he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please." He poured her a cup from the pot on the stove, and she sat across from him. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was hot, and she wrapped her hands around the cup. Ethan pushed one of the ledgers toward her. "This is everything. Income, expenses, debts. It's not pretty." Clara opened the ledger and started reading. The numbers were a mess. Entries crossed out, corrections written in the margins, some pages barely legible. But the story they told was clear enough. The ranch was hemorrhaging money. "You're 3 months behind on the bank loan," she said. 3.5. "And you owe the feed supplier how much?" $260. Clara flipped through more pages. "What about cattle? How many head do you have?" "About 120. We sold off 40 last month just to keep the lights on." "And the land? How much of it do you own outright?" Ethan hesitated. "None of it." Clara looked up sharply. "None?" "It's all mortgaged. Samuel took out the loan 10 years ago to buy the place. He was paying it down, but then his health started going, and things got tight. By the time I got here, he was already behind." Clara set down the ledger. "So let me get this straight. You've got 120 cattle, 2 hired hands, and a piece of land you don't actually own. You're drowning in debt, and you have no plan to fix it." "I have a plan," Ethan said, his voice tight. "I just don't have the help to pull it off." "What's the plan?" "Get through winter, sell beef in the spring, use that money to pay down the loan and buy more stock. Build the herd back up, start making a profit." Clara stared at him. "That's not a plan. That's a prayer." "You got a better idea?" "I might, but first I need to understand what we're working with." She pulled the ledger back toward her. "How much do you pay Hank and Eli?" $20 a month each. "And what do they do?" "Hank handles the horses and does most of the repair work. Eli rides fence, checks the cattle, deals with predators." "Are they good at it?" "Good enough." Clara made a note in the margin. "What about winter feed? Do you have enough hay put up?" Ethan shifted in his chair. "Not as much as I'd like." "How much is not as much?" "Maybe enough for 3 months. 4 if we're careful." Clara closed the ledger and looked at him. "Ethan, winter here is what, 5 months? 6? Closer to 6. Then you're short by half." "I know." She sat back, rubbing her temples. The scope of the problem was starting to sink in, and it was worse than she'd thought. This wasn't just a failing ranch. This was a disaster waiting to happen. "Why did Samuel think he could do this?" she asked quietly. "Why did he think bringing in a wife would fix any of this?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "Because he was desperate, and because he thought maybe someone with a clear head and a steady hand could see things he couldn't. He wasn't trying to trick you, Clara. He needed help, and he didn't know how else to ask for it." Clara wanted to be angry. She wanted to throw the ledger across the room and walk out. But the truth was, she understood desperation. She'd lived with it for years. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to take me through every inch of this ranch. I want to see the cattle, the fences, the outbuildings, all of it. Then we're going to sit down and make a real plan. Not a prayer, a plan." Ethan looked at her, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "You serious?" "Dead serious. I didn't come all this way to watch this place fall apart. If I'm going to spend a month here, I'm going to spend it trying to fix things." Ethan stood, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It was small and tired, but it was real. All right, he said. Let's get to work. Okay. They started with the barn. Ethan pushed open the heavy doors, and Clara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The smell hit her first, hay and leather and horse sweat, familiar and grounding. There were 6 stalls, 3 of them occupied. The horses looked healthy enough, though the tack hanging on the walls was old and cracked in places. Hank was mucking out one of the stalls, and he straightened when they entered. He was older than Clara had thought, maybe 60, with a face like weathered leather and hands that looked like they'd seen every kind of hard work. Hank, Ethan said, this is Clara Wren. She's going to be staying on for a while. Hank looked her over, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Ma'am. Mr. Hank, Clara said. Just Hank. Clara walked along the row of stalls, running her hand along the wood. How long have you worked here? Going on 12 years. And you've seen this place at its best? Hank leaned on his pitchfork. I have. What changed? Hank glanced at Ethan, then back at Clara. Samuel got old, simple as that. Couldn't keep up with the work, couldn't afford to hire enough help. Things started slipping. And now? Now we're holding on by our fingernails. Clara appreciated the honesty. You planning to stay? Hank shrugged. Depends. If there's a paycheck at the end of the month, I'll stay. If not, I'll move on. Fair enough. They left the barn and walked out to the pastures. The cattle were scattered across the hills, grazing on what was left of the summer grass. They looked thin, Clara thought. Not starving, but not thriving either. Ethan pointed to a section of fence in the distance. That whole stretch needs replacing. Eli's been patching it, but it won't hold through winter. How much would it cost to replace? Couple $100 in materials, more if we hire help. Clara filed that away. They walked further and she asked questions about water sources, grazing rotation, predator problems. Ethan answered everything, and she could tell he knew the land, even if he didn't know how to save it. By the time they circled back to the house, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and Clara's feet ached. She wasn't used to this kind of walking, this kind of work, but she wasn't about to complain. They found Eli in the yard, unsaddling his horse. He was younger than Hank, maybe 40, with a wiry build and a face that didn't give much away. Eli, Ethan said, this is Clara. Eli nodded. Heard you were coming. Good things, I hope, Clara said. Didn't hear much of anything. Clara almost laughed. Well, I'm here now, so you'll have to form your own opinion. Eli cinched the saddle over the fence rail. You know anything about cattle? Not a thing. Then what are you doing here? Trying to figure that out myself. Eli looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. Good luck with that. He walked off toward the bunkhouse, and Clara turned to Ethan. He's a charmer. He's good at his job. That's what matters. If you say so. They went back inside and Clara washed up while Ethan started a fire in the stove. He fried up some bacon and potatoes and they ate in silence. The food was plain, but Clara was too hungry to care. After dinner, she pulled out the ledgers again and started making notes. Ethan watched her for a while, then got up and poured himself another cup of coffee. You don't have to do this tonight, he said. Yes, I do. Why? Clara looked up. Because if I stop, I'll start thinking about how insane this is, and if I start thinking about that, I'll walk out that door and never come back. Ethan nodded slowly. Fair enough. He sat back down, and they worked in silence until the fire burned low and the room grew cold. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving around downstairs. She dressed quickly and came down to find Ethan already at the stove, frying eggs. You're up early, she said. Cattle don't wait. Neither does coffee. He poured her a cup, and she sat at the table, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Outside, the sky was just starting to lighten, the stars fading into pale gray. I want to go into town today, Clara said. Ethan looked up. What for? To talk to the bank and the feed supplier. I need to understand exactly where we stand. You don't need to do that. Yes, I do. If we're going to fix this, I need to know who we owe and what kind of terms we're looking at. Ethan set down the spatula. Clara, those men aren't going to take you seriously. They're going to see a woman and think you're wasting their time. Let them think that. I've dealt with worse. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll go after breakfast. They ate quickly, and then Ethan hitched up the wagon. The ride into Copper Ridge took just over an hour, and Clara spent most of it rehearsing what she was going to say. The bank was a small brick building on the main street, and the manager, a man named Mr. Carlson, looked up from his desk when they entered. He was in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Whitlock, he said, standing, didn't expect to see you today. Mr. Carlson, this is Clara Wren. She's helping me manage the ranch. Carlson's eyebrows went up slightly, but he extended his hand. Miss Wren. Clara shook it firmly. Mr. Carlson, I'd like to discuss the loan on Silver Creek Valley Ranch. Carlson's expression shifted, polite but cautious. I'm afraid that's between the bank and Mr. Whitlock. I understand, but Mr. Whitlock has asked me to assist with the financial management, and I need to understand the terms. Carlson looked at Ethan, who nodded. All right, Carlson said slowly. He pulled a file from his desk and opened it. The original loan was for $5,000, taken out 10 years ago. The terms were 10% interest, payable over 15 years. As of this month, the outstanding balance is $3,200. Clara did the math in her head. And how much are the monthly payments? $45, which Mr. Whitlock is currently 3.5 months behind on. Correct. What happens if he defaults? Carlson hesitated. The bank would foreclose on the property. And sell it? Most likely. Clara leaned forward. Mr. Carlson, what would it take to get the loan current? A payment of $157.50, plus the $45 for this month, so just over $200. Yes, Clara sat back. And if we can make that payment, what then? Then the loan would be current, and we'd continue with the regular monthly schedule. And if we wanted to renegotiate the terms, lower the monthly payment in exchange for a longer payoff period? Carlson frowned. That's not something we typically do. But it's not impossible. No, but I'd need to see proof that the ranch can sustain the payments, income statements, projections, that sort of thing. Clara nodded. I'll have those for you within the week. Carlson looked surprised. You will? I will. They left the bank and Ethan helped Clara back into the wagon. He didn't say anything until they were out of town. $200, he said. We don't have that. Not yet, but we will. How? Clara looked at him. We're going to sell something, cattle, equipment, whatever we can spare, and we're going to do it fast. Ethan shook his head. We sell any more cattle, we won't have enough to rebuild the herd in the spring. And if we don't get current on the loan, there won't be a spring. The bank will take the ranch, and it'll all be over. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. They stopped at the feed supplier next, a rough-looking warehouse on the edge of town. The owner, a man named Briggs, was less polite than Carlson. You're behind, he said flatly when Clara asked about the account. $260. I've been patient, but my patience is running out. We'll pay you, Clara said. When? Within the month, Briggs snorted. I've heard that before. This time it's true. Why should I believe you? Clara met his eyes. Because if you cut us off, we'll take our business to Dawson's and Helena, and you'll lose more than $260. Briggs stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark. You've got guts, I'll give you that. I've got a plan. That's better than guts. We'll see. They left, and Ethan looked at her with something like admiration. You weren't kidding about dealing with worse. Clara shrugged. Men like Briggs respect one thing, strength. You show weakness, and they'll bury you. Where'd you learn that? St. Louis. I worked for a landlady who could have run a railroad. She taught me a lot. Ethan smiled. Remind me not to get on your bad side. Too late for that. He laughed, and Clara felt something shift between them. Not friendship exactly, but maybe the beginning of trust. They spent the next week working from dawn until dark. Clara went through every piece of paper on the ranch, reorganizing the records, tracking every expense, every sale, every debt. She found inefficiencies everywhere, overpaying for supplies, selling cattle at the wrong time, failing to negotiate better terms. She also found potential. The land was good, The water was reliable. The cattle, though thin, were decent stock. With better management, the ranch could turn a profit. But it would take time, and money they didn't have. One evening, Clara was sitting at the table with the ledgers when Ethan came in, covered in dust and sweat. He washed up at the basin, then sat across from her. "You've been at this for hours," he said. "I'm close to something." "To what?" Clara tapped the page. "A way out, but it's going to take a gamble." Ethan leaned forward. "I'm listening." "We sell 20 head of cattle. That'll give us enough to get current on the loan and pay down half of what we owe Briggs. Then we use the rest of the herd to breed. We buy a good bull, let the cows calve in the spring, and sell the calves in the fall. If we manage it right, we'll double our income." Ethan frowned. "That's a big if." "It is, but it's the only option I see. What if the calves don't sell? What if we lose stock over winter? Then we're in the same place we are now, or worse." Clara looked at him. "But if we don't try, the bank takes the ranch in 3 months. This way, at least we have a chance." Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. "All right, let's do it." They sold the cattle the following week. Ethan drove them into Copper Ridge, and Clara negotiated the price with a buyer from Helena. She got more than Ethan expected, and when they walked away with $412, he looked at her like she'd just pulled off a miracle. "How did you do that?" he asked. "I told him the truth, that the cattle were good stock, and if he didn't buy them, someone else would." "And he believed you?" "He believed I wasn't going to back down." They paid off the bank that afternoon. Carlson counted the money twice, then stamped the receipt and handed it over. "You're current," he said. "For now." "We'll stay that way," Clara said. Carlson looked at her and she saw something in his expression. Respect, maybe, or at least curiosity. They paid Briggs next, handing over half of what they owed. He grumbled, but he took it. "Rest in 2 weeks," Clara said. "It better be." "It will." On the way back to the ranch, Ethan was quiet. Clara glanced at him. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "I'm just thinking," he said slowly, "that I made the right call asking you to stay." Clara felt something warm flicker in her chest, but she pushed it down. "Don't get sentimental on me, Whitlock. We've still got a long way to go." "I know, but we're moving in the right direction." "Maybe." They rode in silence for a while, and Clara watched the landscape roll past. The mountains were sharper now, outlined against the fading light, and the air had a bite to it that hadn't been there before. Winter was coming, and with it, a whole new set of problems. But for the first time since stepping off that train, Clara felt like maybe, just maybe, she could handle it. Back at the ranch, things started to settle into a rhythm. Clara managed the books and the supplies. Ethan and the crew handled the cattle and the land. Hank fixed what was broken. Eli rode the fences and kept the predators at bay. It wasn't easy. There were days when Clara wanted to scream, when the numbers didn't add up and the weight of it all felt crushing. But she kept going, because the alternative was giving up, and she'd never been good at that. One afternoon, she was in the barn checking the feed inventory when Hank found her. "Got a question for you," he said. Clara looked up. "What is it?" "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "All this." He gestured vaguely. "The books, the planning, the running around. You could have walked away, but you didn't." Clara set down her pencil. "I don't know. Maybe because I don't have anywhere else to go, or maybe because I'm tired of running." Hank nodded slowly. "Samuel would have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so. He had a good sense for people. If he wrote to you, it's because he saw something." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Hank tipped his hat and left, and Clara went back to her inventory. But his words stayed with her. That night, after dinner, Clara was sitting by the fire when Ethan came in from checking the horses. He poured himself some coffee and sat across from her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "Why did you answer Samuel's ad? What were you looking for?" Clara stared into the fire. "A way out. I'd been taking care of my aunt for 5 years. She was sick, and I was the only family she had. When she died, I had nothing, no money, no prospects. I saw Samuel's ad in the paper, and I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is my chance to start over. And now?" Now I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here, so I might as well make the most of it. Ethan nodded. For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed. Clara looked at him, and for the first time she saw past the exhaustion and the worry. She saw someone who was trying just as hard as she was, someone who was just as lost. Me too, she said quietly. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not certainty, but maybe the beginning of it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Winter was almost here, and Clara was ready. The first snow came 2 weeks later, light and fleeting, dusting the hills with white before melting by noon. But it was a warning, and everyone on the ranch felt it. Clara stood on the porch that morning, watching the flakes drift down, and felt the cold settle into her bones. She pulled her shawl tighter and went back inside to check the supplies one more time. They were close, dangerously close. The hay would last maybe 4 months if they rationed it carefully. The feed for the horses was better, but not by much, and they still owed Briggs $130. She was running the numbers again when Ethan came in, stomping snow off his boots. Eli says the creek's starting to ice up on the north end, he said. Clara looked up. Already? Yeah, we need to move the cattle closer to the main water source before it freezes solid. How long will that take? 2 days? Maybe 3? Depends on how cooperative they are. Clara nodded and made a note. What about the fence repairs? Are they done? Ethan hesitated. Most of them. Most isn't good enough. I know, but we're running out of wire and I can't afford to buy more until we settle up with Briggs. Clara set down her pencil and rubbed her eyes. The exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. She'd been working 14-hour days for weeks, and it was showing. We'll figure it out, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Ethan sat down across from her. You need to rest. I'll rest when we're not 1 bad week away from losing everything. Clara, I'm fine. He looked at her for a long moment, then stood. All right, but when you collapse, don't say I didn't warn you. Noted. He left, and Clara went back to her numbers. But the words blurred together, and after a few minutes, she gave up. She walked to the window and stared out at the falling snow. She thought about St. Louis, about her aunt's cramped apartment and the endless gray days, about the feeling of being trapped, of watching her life slip away one obligation at a time. This was different. Harder, maybe. But at least it was hers. At least she was choosing it all. Moving the cattle took longer than expected. The animals were skittish, unwilling to leave the familiar pastures, and the snow didn't help. Ethan, Eli, and Hank spent 2 full days driving them down into the valley, and by the time they finished, all 3 men looked ready to drop. Clara had hot coffee and stew waiting when they came back, and Hank ate 3 bowls before he said a word. Those cows are going to be trouble all winter, he muttered. Mark my words. They're always trouble, Eli said. That's the job. Clara poured more coffee. How much hay did we use? About what you'd expect, Ethan said. Maybe a little less. Good. We need to stretch every bale as far as it'll go. Hank looked at her. You ever dealt with a Montana winter before? No? Then you don't know what you're in for. It's not like back east. Out here, winter doesn't just slow you down. It stops you cold, literally. I'll manage. I'm sure you will, Hank said, and there was something almost approving in his tone. After dinner, Claire went upstairs and sat by the small stove in her room, letting the heat seep into her hands. She'd been on the ranch for almost 3 weeks, and the month she'd promised Ethan was already half gone. She should have been thinking about leaving, about where she'd go next, what she'd do, but every time she tried to picture it, her mind went blank. Because the truth was, she didn't want to leave. The thought startled her. She'd come here angry, desperate, with no intention of staying beyond the agreed-upon time. But somewhere in the long days and cold nights, something had shifted. She cared about this place, about the cattle and the land and the people trying to hold it all together. And maybe, just maybe, she cared about Ethan too. Not in a romantic way. At least, that's what she told herself. But in the way you cared about someone who fought beside you, who didn't give up even when the odds were stacked against them. Clara shook her head and stood. She was being ridiculous. She needed sleep, not sentiment. But as she lay down that night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, Clara was in the barn checking the tack when she heard voices outside. She stepped out to find a man on horseback talking to Ethan. He was older, maybe 50, with a heavy coat and a rifle slung across his saddle. "Who's that?" Clara asked Hank, who was standing nearby. "Name's Porter. Owns the land to the east." "What does he want?" "Nothing good, I'd wager." Clara walked over and Porter's eyes flicked to her, then back to Ethan. "This your wife?" Porter asked. "No," Ethan said quickly. "This is Clara Wren. She's helping manage the ranch." Porter tipped his hat, but his expression didn't soften. "Miss Wren." "Mr. Porter." Porter turned back to Ethan. "I came to make you an offer." "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard the offer yet." Ethan crossed his arms. "I don't need to." "The answer's no." Porter sighed. "Look, Whitlock, I'm trying to do you a favor. This place is falling apart. You're behind on your loan, you're barely scraping by, and winter's coming. I'll give you a fair price, more than the bank will when they foreclose. The bank's not going to foreclose." "You sure about that?" Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Porter, as Mr. Whitlock said, the ranch isn't for sale. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Porter looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "You've got some nerve, lady." "So I've been told." Porter's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He pulled his horse around and rode off without another word. Ethan watched him go, his expression dark. "Who is he?" Clara asked. "Neighbor. He's been trying to buy this place for years. Samuel always refused, and so will I." "Why does he want it so badly?" "Water rights. Silver Creek runs through our land before it hits his. He thinks if he owns this place, he can control the water." Clara frowned. "Can he?" "Not legally, but that doesn't mean he won't try." Hank spat into the dirt. "Porter's a snake, always has been." Ethan nodded. "Yeah. And now that Samuel's gone, he probably thinks I'm an easy target." "Are you?" Clara asked. Ethan looked at her. "No." "Good. Because if he comes back, I'll handle him." Ethan almost smiled. "I don't doubt it." Oh. The days grew shorter and colder. The snow that had been light and fleeting became steady, piling up in drifts against the barn and the fences. Clara learned to dress in layers, to keep her hands moving so they didn't go numb, to brew coffee strong enough to strip paint. She also learned to work alongside the men. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because there was too much to do and not enough hands to do it. She mucked stalls, hauled feed, and even helped Hank repair a section of roof that had started leaking. Eli watched her with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect, and one afternoon as they were stacking hay, he said, "You're tougher than you look." Clara glanced at him. "Is that a compliment?" "Close as you're going to get from me." She laughed. "I'll take it." By the end of the 4th week, Clara had stopped thinking about the train east. She'd stopped counting down the days. She just worked, and when the work was done, she sat by the fire and tried not to think too hard about what came next. One evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. He leaned against the doorframe, watching. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know, but we're out of bread and I'm not eating hardtack for another week." "Fair point." He sat at the table and Clara worked in silence for a while, her hands rhythmic and sure. "Your month's almost up," Ethan said quietly. Clara didn't look at him. "I know." "You planning to leave?" She stopped kneading and wiped her hands on her apron. Then she turned to face him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Part of me thinks I should. I came here for something that doesn't exist, and staying feels like, I don't know, like I'm lying to myself." "And the other part?" Clara sat down across from him. "The other part thinks maybe I found something better, something real." Ethan's eyes searched hers. "You mean the ranch?" "I mean all of it. The work, the people, the purpose, I guess." He nodded slowly. "What would it take for you to stay?" Clara hesitated. "Honesty. I need to know what I'm getting into. Not just with the ranch, but with you." "What do you want to know?" "Why did you really help Samuel write those letters?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "Because I owed him. He took me in when I had nothing, gave me a place to sleep, work to do, a reason to keep going. When he said he wanted to find a wife, I thought it was crazy, but he was serious, and he asked me to help, so I did. And when he died, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. The ranch was falling apart, and I thought if I could just hold on until you got here, maybe you'd see something worth saving. In the ranch or in you? Ethan's head snapped up. Both, I guess. Clara studied him. There was no artifice in his expression, no attempt to charm or manipulate. Just raw, uncomfortable honesty. All right, she said. I'll stay. But not as a temporary hand. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it as a partner. Equal say, equal share. Ethan blinked. You serious? Dead serious. Claire, you don't have to. I'm not doing this out of charity, Ethan. I'm doing it because I think we can make this work. But only if we're honest with each other. No more secrets. No more half-truths. Ethan reached across the table and held out his hand. Deal. Clara shook it, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to certainty. Check. The next few weeks were brutal. Winter came down hard, and with it, a string of problems that seemed designed to break them. First, 3 cows died in a sudden cold snap, their bodies frozen stiff by the time Eli found them. Clara watched as the men dragged them out of the pasture, and she felt the loss like a punch to the gut. Each cow represented money they didn't have, income they couldn't replace. Then the well pump froze, and it took Hank 2 days to get it working again. In the meantime, they hauled water by hand from the creek, their backs aching, their hands raw. And then, just when Clara thought things couldn't get worse, Porter came back. He rode up to the house one afternoon with 2 men flanking him, both armed. Clara was chopping wood when she saw them, and she dropped the axe and ran inside. Ethan! He came down the stairs, pulling on his coat. What is it? Porter's here, and he brought friends. Ethan's expression hardened. He grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door and stepped outside. Clara followed. Porter dismounted and stood in the yard, his hands resting on his gun belt. Whitlock, he said, we need to talk. I've got nothing to say to you. I think you do. See, I've been doing some checking. Turns out your loan's in trouble, real trouble, and I'm guessing you don't have the cash to fix it. That's none of your business. It is when your ranch is about to go under and flood my land with your problems. Porter stepped closer. I'm making you a final offer. $3,000. Cash. You take it, sign over the deed, and walk away clean. No. Porter's jaw tightened. You're a fool, Whitlock. You can't save this place. Maybe not. But I'm going to die trying. One of Porter's men shifted, his hand moving toward his gun. Clara's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, putting herself between Ethan and the strangers. Mr. Porter, she said, her voice calm but firm. You're trespassing, and if you or your men make one more move, I'll make sure the sheriff knows about it. Porter stared at her. You think the sheriff cares about this dirt pile? I think he cares about the law. And I think he'll care even more when I tell him you came here armed, making threats. Porter's eyes narrowed. You've got a big mouth, lady. And you've got 10 seconds to get off this property before I make good on my promise. For a moment, no one moved. Then Porter laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You're going to regret this, he said. I doubt it. He mounted his horse and rode off, his men following. Clara watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned to Ethan. He was staring at her, something like awe in his expression. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen, he said. Clara's hands were shaking, but she crossed her arms to hide it. He was bluffing. Maybe. But you didn't know that. No, I didn't. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Too late. They went back inside, and Clara sat by the fire, trying to calm her racing heart. Hank came in a few minutes later, having watched the whole thing from the barn. You've got guts, Miss Clara, he said, but Porter's not going to let this go. I know. So what are you going to do? Clara looked at him. Win. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the confrontation in her mind, hearing Porter's voice, seeing the guns on his men's hips. She got up and went downstairs, thinking a cup of tea might help. But when she reached the kitchen, she found Ethan already there, staring into the fire. Couldn't sleep either? She asked. He shook his head. Keep thinking about what Porter said. About the loan. Clara sat down. We'll figure it out. How? We're barely keeping our heads above water as it is. If the bank calls the loan early, we're finished. They won't. Carlson gave us time. For now. But Porter's got influence. If he leans on the bank, they might change their minds. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So we don't give them a reason to. We stay current. We show them we're good for it." "And how do we do that?" "We sell more cattle. Not a lot. Just enough to cover the next few payments and buy some breathing room." Ethan frowned. "We can't keep bleeding the herd, Clara. At some point, there won't be anything left to sell." "I know, but right now we need time more than we need cattle. We survive the winter. We rebuild in the spring." Ethan looked at her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he'd been carrying alone for so long. "You really think we can do this?" he asked. "I don't know, but I think we have to try." He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll sell, but..." They sold 15 head the following week, and Clara negotiated hard, refusing to let the buyer lowball them. When they walked away with enough to cover 3 months' worth of payments, Ethan looked at her like she'd just performed a miracle. "You're terrifying when you negotiate," he said. "Good. That means it's working." They paid the bank, and Carlson stamped the receipt with the same careful precision as before. "You're doing better than I expected," he said. Clara smiled tightly. "We aim to surprise." On the way back to the ranch, Ethan was quiet. Clara glanced at him. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "I was just thinking about what you said, about being partners." "What about it?" "I want to make it official, not just words. I want to draw up papers, split everything 50-50, you and me." Clara stared at him. "Ethan, you don't have to..." "Yes, I do. You've earned it, and I don't want there to be any question about where you stand." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "All right, we'll do it." "Good." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the ranch, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, fear, hope, all tangled together. She was tied to this place now, for better or worse, and the thought didn't scare her as much as it should have. Winter deepened, and the ranch settled into a fragile rhythm. The cattle stayed close to the main pasture, huddled together against the cold. The men rotated shifts, checking on them every few hours, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling feed. Clara managed the inside work, cooking, mending, keeping the books. But she also spent time in the barn, learning how to handle the horses, how to check their hooves, how to calm them when the wind howled and the walls creaked. One afternoon, she was brushing down one of the mares when Ethan found her. "You're getting good at that," he said. Clara glanced at him. "I've had good teachers." He leaned against the stall door, watching her work. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you ever regret staying?" Clara paused, the brush still in her hand. "Sometimes. When the work feels endless, or the numbers don't add up, or I'm so tired I can barely stand. But then I think about what I'd be doing if I'd left, and no, I don't regret it." "What would you be doing?" "I don't know, looking for work, living in some cramped room, trying to survive." She turned to face him. "Here, at least I'm building something. It matters." Ethan nodded. "It matters to me, too." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable. Then Ethan said, "There's something I need to tell you." Clara's stomach tightened. "What?" "Samuel. Before he died, he asked me to take care of the ranch, to keep it going, but he also asked me to make sure you were taken care of, if you came. He didn't know if I'd come." "No. But he hoped you would, and he made me promise that if you did, I'd do right by you." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that this isn't just about saving the ranch. It's about keeping a promise to Samuel and to you." Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the exhaustion and the worry and the weight he carried. She saw someone trying to do the right thing, even when it was hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan nodded and left, and Clara went back to brushing the mare, but her hands were shaking, and it took her a long time to steady them. Basik. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They had no money for gifts, no time for celebration. But Hank managed to shoot a wild turkey, and Clara roasted it with the last of the potatoes and carrots from the root cellar. They ate together at the big table, Clara, Ethan, Hank, and Eli. And for a little while, the weight of the world felt lighter. "This is good," Hank said, gesturing at his plate. "Real good." "Thank you," Clara said. Eli nodded. Better than hardtack, Clara laughed. That's not exactly high praise. It is from him, Ethan said, and even Eli cracked a small smile. After dinner, they sat by the fire, and Hank told stories about his years on the ranch, about cattle drives and blizzards and close calls with wolves. Clara listened, fascinated, and she realized how little she still knew about this world. But she was learning, slowly, and that was enough. Later, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Clara stood on the porch and looked out at the snow-covered hills. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the valley, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but it was beautiful. Ethan came out and stood beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said. "Thanks." They stood in silence, and after a while Ethan said, "I'm glad you stayed." Clara looked at him. "So am I." He smiled, and Clara felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, but something close, something that felt like the beginning of it. The cold snap that followed New Year's was vicious. Temperatures dropped so low that the water in the bucket by the door froze solid overnight, and the wind cut through every gap in the walls like a knife. Clara woke one morning to find frost on the inside of her window, delicate patterns of ice that would have been beautiful if they hadn't meant the house was losing heat faster than the stove could replace it. She dressed quickly, layering everything she owned, and went downstairs to find Ethan already stoking the fire. "Morning," he said without looking up. "How cold is it?" "Cold enough that Hank's talking about moving the horses into the barn full time." Clara poured herself coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup. "Can we afford the extra feed?" "We don't have a choice. They won't make it outside in this." She nodded and sat at the table, going over the numbers in her head. They were stretched thin, thinner than she wanted to admit. Every decision felt like a gamble, every expense a risk they couldn't afford to take, but couldn't afford not to. Ethan finished with the fire and sat across from her. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. "You look tired," Clara said. "So do you." "Fair point." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Ethan said, "I've been thinking about Porter." Clara's stomach tightened. "What about him?" "He's not going to stop. He wants this land, and he's the kind of man who gets what he wants." "Not this time." "Clara, I'm serious. If he decides to push, he's got the money and the connections to make our lives hell. So what do you want to do? Sell to him?" "No, but I think we need to be ready for whatever he throws at us." Clara set down her cup. "I'm already ready." Ethan looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "I know you are. I just don't want you to get hurt because of this." "I'm already in it, Ethan. We both are. And I'm not backing down." He nodded slowly. "All right. Then we fight." "Damn right we do." Chikain. The lawyer came a week later. Clara was in the barn when Hank found her, his expression grim. "There's a man at the house," he said. "Says he's from the bank." Clara's heart sank. "Did he say what he wants?" "No, but he's got papers." She walked to the house, her boots crunching in the snow, and found a thin man in a dark coat standing on the porch. Ethan was already there, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "Miss Wren," the man said, tipping his hat. "I'm Mr. Graves, representing First Bank of Copper Ridge." "What do you want?" Clara asked. Graves pulled a folded document from his coat. "I'm here to deliver a formal notice. The bank has received a complaint regarding the financial stability of Silver Creek Valley Ranch. As a result, they've requested a full audit of your accounts and operations." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "An audit?" "Yes, ma'am. To be conducted within the next 30 days. "Who filed the complaint?" Ethan demanded. Graves' expression didn't change. "I'm not at liberty to say." "It was Porter," Clara said. "Wasn't it?" Graves handed her the papers. "You'll find all the details here. Good day." He left, and Clara stood on the porch, staring at the document in her hands. Ethan took it from her and read through it, his face darkening with every line. "This is bad," he said. "How bad?" "If they find anything out of order, anything at all, they can call the loan immediately. We'd have 30 days to pay in full or lose the ranch." Clara sank onto the porch steps. "We can't pay in full. We don't have that kind of money." "I know." She looked up at him. "So what do we do?" Ethan sat beside her. We make sure they don't find anything. We go through every record, every receipt, every transaction. We make it airtight. And if it's not, then we fix it. Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something, to tear the papers into pieces and watch them scatter in the wind. But instead, she stood and straightened her shoulders. All right, she said, let's get to work. What? They spent the next 3 weeks going through every scrap of paper on the ranch. Clara worked late into the night, cross-referencing entries, checking totals, making sure every number was exact. Ethan helped when he could, but the ranch still needed running, and he couldn't afford to let things slip. Hank and Eli picked up the slack, working longer hours, pushing through exhaustion. Clara saw it in their faces, the strain, the worry. They didn't say much, but she knew they understood what was at stake. One evening, Clara was at the table with the ledgers spread out in front of her when Ethan came in, covered in snow. It's coming down hard, he said, shaking off his coat. Eli thinks we might lose another cow if it doesn't let up. Clara didn't look up. We can't afford to lose another cow. I know. Then make sure we don't. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Clara, you need to sleep. I will. When this is done. You've been at this for 16 hours. And I'll be at it for 16 more if that's what it takes. Ethan crossed the room and gently took the pencil from her hand. You're not going to do anyone any good if you collapse. Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. I'm scared, she said quietly. Ethan sat beside her. So am I. What if we lose? We won't. You don't know that. No, but I know we're not going down without a fight. Clara looked at him, and she saw the determination in his eyes, the refusal to give up. It was the same thing that had kept her going these past months, the same stubborn belief that they could pull this off. All right, she said, I'll sleep, but we start again at first light. Deal. The auditor arrived on a gray morning in late January. He was a small man with round spectacles and a leather case full of forms. His name was Mr. Fletcher, and he wasted no time getting started. Clara showed him to the table where she'd laid out every ledger, every receipt, every piece of documentation she could find. Fletcher sat down and began going through them methodically, his pen scratching as he made notes. Ethan hovered nearby, and Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. She wanted to tell him to relax, that everything was in order, but she didn't trust her own voice. Fletcher worked in silence for hours. He asked questions occasionally about specific entries, about dates, about payments. Clara answered each one as clearly as she could, keeping her tone even, professional. By midday, Fletcher had gone through half the records. He paused, removed his spectacles, and cleaned them with a handkerchief. Miss Wren, he said, these records are quite thorough. Clara's heart skipped. Thank you. However, I do have some concerns. Her stomach dropped. What kind of concerns? Fletcher flipped to a page near the back of one ledger. There's a discrepancy here. A payment listed as made to the feed supplier in October, but I don't see a corresponding receipt. Clara leaned over and looked at the entry. Her mind raced. She remembered that payment. She'd made it herself in cash because Briggs had been refusing credit. The receipt is here, she said, pulling a folder from the stack. She found the slip and handed it to Fletcher. He examined it, then nodded. Very good. Clara exhaled. Fletcher continued working, and with each hour, Clara felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. But slowly, painstakingly, he made his way through the records. By late afternoon, he closed the final ledger and set down his pen. Well, he said, I must say, I'm impressed. Clara blinked. You are? Yes. Given the circumstances, I expected to find significant irregularities. But your records are remarkably well maintained. Everything appears to be in order. Clara felt her knees go weak. So, you're approving the audit? I am. I'll submit my report to the bank tomorrow. Assuming there are no objections, your loan will remain in good standing. Clara wanted to cry. She wanted to collapse. Instead, she held out her hand. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. He shook it. You've done good work here, Miss Wren. Keep it up. After he left, Clara stood in the middle of the room, staring at the closed door. Ethan came up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said. Clara turned to him, and the relief finally broke through. She felt tears prick her eyes, and she didn't try to stop them. "We did it," she said. Ethan pulled her into a hug, and for a moment Clara let herself lean into him, let herself feel the weight of what they'd just survived. They'd won. For now. February brought a brief thaw, and with it, a sense of cautious optimism. The snow melted enough to reveal patches of brown grass, and the cattle moved more freely, grazing on what they could find. Clara used the break to reassess their situation. The audit had cleared them, but they were still barely scraping by. The herd was smaller than she wanted, and they'd burned through most of their cash reserves just staying afloat. But they were still standing, and that was something. One afternoon, she was outside hanging laundry when she saw a rider approaching. Her first thought was Porter, and her hand instinctively went to the rifle propped against the porch. But as the rider got closer, she realized it was a woman. Clara set down the laundry basket and walked to meet her. The woman dismounted, and Clara saw she was young, maybe 30, with auburn hair and a no-nonsense expression. "Can I help you?" Clara asked. "I'm looking for Ethan Whitlock. He's in the barn. Can I ask what this is about?" The woman looked her over. "You must be Clara Wren." Clara frowned. "How do you know my name?" "Word travels. I'm Margaret Hale. I own a ranch about 15 miles south of here." Clara relaxed slightly. "What can we do for you?" "I heard you had trouble with Porter." Clara's guard went back up. "What about it?" Margaret smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Porter's been trying to squeeze me out for years. I thought maybe we could help each other." Clara studied her. "How?" "Let's talk inside. It's cold out here." Clara led her to the house and called for Ethan. He came in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped short when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Hale," he said, surprised. "Mr. Whitlock." They sat at the table, and Margaret got straight to the point. "Porter's been buying up land all over the valley," she said. "Small ranches, mostly. Places that are struggling. He makes low-ball offers, and when people refuse, he makes their lives difficult. Bank pressure, supply problems, that kind of thing." "We've noticed," Clara said dryly. "I figured. But here's the thing. He can't buy what we don't sell. If we band together, refuse to deal with him, he loses his leverage." Ethan leaned back. "You're talking about an alliance. I'm talking about survival. Individually, we're vulnerable. Together, we're a problem he can't solve." Clara exchanged a look with Ethan. "What would this alliance look like?" "Shared resources. If one of us needs help, extra hands, equipment, whatever, the others step in. We negotiate with suppliers as a group, get better prices. And we present a united front to Porter, make it clear he's not getting any of our land." "And if he escalates?" Ethan asked. "Then we escalate right back. I've got a lawyer in Helena who's been itching to go after Porter for years. Give him enough ammunition and he'll bury the man in litigation." Clara felt a spark of hope. "How many ranchers are in?" "3 so far, counting me. With you, that's 4. I'm working on a 5th. "And you think this'll work?" Margaret's expression hardened. "I think it's our only shot." Clara looked at Ethan. He nodded. "We're in," Clara said. Margaret smiled. A real one this time. "Good. I'll set up a meeting. We'll hammer out the details." After she left, Clara stood at the window, watching her ride away. "Do you trust her?" Ethan asked. "I don't know, but I think she's right. We can't fight Porter alone." "No, we can't." Clara turned to him. "This could change everything. Or it could blow up in our faces." Always the optimist. Ethan smiled. "Someone has to be." The first meeting of what Margaret called the Valley Alliance took place 2 weeks later at her ranch. Clara and Ethan rode over together, and Clara was struck by how well-maintained the place was. The fences were solid, the barn freshly painted, the house neat and tidy. Margaret met them at the door and led them inside, where 3 other ranchers were already waiting. She introduced them. John Garrett, a grizzled man in his 60s who ran cattle on the north side of the valley. Tom and Sarah Pruitt, a younger couple who'd only been ranching for a few years. And finally, a man named Daniel Cross, who owned a smaller spread near the river. They sat around Margaret's kitchen table, and she laid out the plan. "First thing we do is pool our purchasing power," she said. "We negotiate with the feed suppliers as a group. Briggs has been gouging all of us for years. If we threaten to take our business to Helena, he'll come around." John Garrett nodded. I'm for that. Second, we share labor during peak times. Calving season, branding, whatever. If one of us is short-handed, the others pitch in. Sarah Pruitt spoke up. What about water rights? Porter's been trying to claim more of the river for years. We file a joint complaint with the territorial office, Margaret said. Make it clear we're watching him. And if he retaliates, Daniel Cross asked, then we fight back. Legal channels first. But if he crosses the line, we respond in kind. Clara listened, her mind turning over the implications. It was risky, but it was also smart. I'm in, she said. One by one, the others agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon working out the details. Who would handle what, how they'd communicate, what they'd do in various scenarios. By the time they left, Clara felt like they'd actually accomplished something. On the ride back, Ethan was quiet. What are you thinking? Clara asked. I'm thinking this might actually work. You sound surprised. I am. I didn't think we'd find allies, Clara smiled. Shows what you know. He laughed, and the sound was lighter than she'd heard in weeks. Spring came slowly, reluctantly. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy ground and the first hints of green. The cattle started calving, and Clara spent long nights in the barn with Ethan and Hank, helping deliver the newborns. It was hard work, exhausting and messy, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. Each calf that survived felt like a small victory, a promise that maybe they could rebuild after all. One night, Clara was leaning against the barn wall, watching a newborn calf struggle to its feet, when Ethan sat down beside her. You're getting good at this, he said. I'm getting tired of being covered in mud. He grinned. That's part of the job. Clara looked at him. His face was streaked with dirt, his hair a mess, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but he also looked happy. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Do you ever think about what comes next? After all this? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, sometimes. And? And I don't know, I guess I just hope we get there. Clara nodded. Me too. They sat in silence, and then Ethan said, What about you? What do you want? Clara thought about it. A year ago, she would have said stability, security, a place to call home. But now? I want this, she said. The ranch, the work, all of it. Ethan looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. You've got it, he said. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, and she smiled. But by April, the alliance was in full swing. They'd renegotiated with Briggs, cutting their feed costs by nearly 20%. They'd filed the water rights complaint, and the territorial office had sent someone to investigate Porter's claims. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to improve. The calves were strong and healthy. The spring rains brought fresh grass. The cattle fattened up, and Clara started planning for the fall sale. Porter hadn't made another move, but Clara knew he was watching, waiting for them to slip. But they didn't. One evening, Clara was on the porch watching the sunset when Ethan joined her. He handed her a cup of coffee and leaned against the railing. Margaret sent word, he said. She wants to meet next week. Talk about expanding the alliance. Expanding how? Bringing in more ranchers, making it official. Clara nodded. That's smart. Yeah. They stood in silence, and then Ethan said, Clara, I need to tell you something. Her heart skipped. What? He turned to face her. When you first got here, I thought you were going to leave. I thought you'd take one look at this place and get back on the train. But you didn't. You stayed. And you saved this ranch. Clara shook her head. We saved it, together. Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without you. She looked at him, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Ethan, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I wanted you to know what you mean to this place, what you mean to me. Clara's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should say anything, so instead she reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her, and he smiled. They stood there as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not certainty. Not yet. But something close, something that felt like home, The hand-holding on the porch didn't change everything overnight. Clara and Ethan still worked from before dawn until after dark, still fought over expenses and decisions, still fell into bed exhausted most nights without another word between them. But something had shifted, subtle as the turn from winter to spring, and they both felt it. Clara caught herself watching him more often, the way he moved when he worked with the horses, the concentration on his face when he was mending fence, the rare moments when he smiled and looked 10 years younger. And sometimes, when she glanced up from the ledgers, she'd find him watching her too. They didn't talk about it. There wasn't time, and maybe neither of them knew what to say. But the silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. May arrived with warm winds and the kind of bright green grass that made the cattle look fat and content. The calves were thriving, and Claire's projections for the fall sale were better than she'd dared hope. The alliance with Margaret and the other ranchers was holding strong, and even Briggs had grudgingly admitted that the new arrangement was working. But Porter was still out there, waiting. Clara was in town one afternoon picking up supplies when she saw him outside the bank. He was talking to Carlson, their heads close together, and something about the conversation made her stomach tighten. She finished her business and headed back to the wagon, but Porter caught up with her before she could leave. "Miss Wren," he said, tipping his hat. "Fancy seeing you here." Clara didn't slow down. "Mr. Porter, I hear your little alliance is doing well. We're managing, for now." He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "But winter's a long way off. A lot can happen between now and then." Clara met his eyes. "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation. This valley's a tough place. Not everyone makes it." "We will." Porter smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." He walked away, and Clara stood there, her hands clenched around the supply list. She didn't mention the encounter to Ethan when she got back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Porter was planning something. A week later, she found out what. She was going through the mail when she found a letter from the Territorial Land Office. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a notice of dispute. Porter had filed a claim asserting that the southern boundary of Silver Creek Valley Ranch encroached on his property by nearly 40 acres. He was demanding a survey, and if his claim was upheld, compensation or forfeiture of the disputed land. Clara read the letter 3 times, her heart sinking with each pass. 40 acres was a significant chunk of their best grazing land. Losing it would cripple them. Ethan came in from the barn and saw her face. "What is it?" She handed him the letter without a word. He read it, and his expression darkened. "That son of a—" "It's not true," Clara said. "The boundary's been set for years. Samuel had the original survey documents." "Where are they?" Clara's mind raced. "I don't know. I haven't seen them in the records." They spent the next 2 days tearing the house apart looking for the documents. They checked every drawer, every box, every dusty corner of the attic. Nothing. On the 3rd day, Hank found Clara in the barn, her head in her hands. "You all right, Miss Clara?" She looked up. "Did Samuel ever mention where he kept important papers? Legal documents, that kind of thing?" Hank scratched his beard. "He had a lockbox. Kept it in his room, I think, under the floorboards." Clara was on her feet in an instant. "Show me." Hank led her upstairs to what had been Samuel's room, the room Clara now slept in. He pointed to a spot near the window. "Right about there, if I remember." Clara knelt and ran her hands over the boards. One of them felt loose. She pried it up with a knife and found a small metal box underneath. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were papers, deeds, contracts, a will, and at the bottom, a yellowed survey map dated 15 years earlier. Clara spread it out on the floor, and Ethan crouched beside her. The boundary line was clear, marked in faded ink. Porter's claim was completely false. The land was theirs, had always been theirs. "We've got him," Ethan said. Clara nodded, relief flooding through her. "We need to get this to the land office." "I'll ride to Helena first thing tomorrow." But that night Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Porter, about the lengths he was willing to go to get what he wanted. A false land claim was bold, even for him. It meant he was desperate. And desperate men were dangerous. She got up and went downstairs, intending to make tea. But when she reached the kitchen, she found Ethan already there, staring into the fire. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head. "Keep thinking about what comes next." "What do you mean? Porter's not going to stop. Even if we prove he's lying about the boundary, he'll find something else. some other way to come at us. Clara sat beside him. So what do we do? We finish this once and for all. How? Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Margaret's lawyer, the one she mentioned. If we can prove Porter's been using fraud and intimidation to steal land, we can get him brought up on charges, maybe even sent to prison. Clara's pulse quickened. That's a big accusation. It's the truth. We've seen it ourselves, and I bet the Pruitts and the others have stories too. You think they'd testify? I think they're as tired of Porter as we are. Clara thought about it. It was risky. Taking on a man like Porter in court could backfire spectacularly, but doing nothing meant living under his shadow forever. All right, she said, let's do it. Ethan looked at her and she saw the determination in his eyes. You sure? I'm sure. He reached out and took her hand, the same way she'd taken his on the porch. Thank you. Clara squeezed his fingers. We're partners, remember? We do this together. Ethan rode to Helena the next day with the survey documents. Clara stayed behind to keep the ranch running, but her mind was on the fight ahead. She sent word to Margaret, explaining the situation, and Margaret responded immediately. 2 days later, the entire alliance gathered at Silver Creek Valley Ranch. Margaret brought her lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Owen Kincaid, who looked like he could argue the devil into a corner. John Garrett, the Pruitts, and Daniel Cross all came too, and they sat around Clara's kitchen table like generals planning a war. Kincaid listened as each of them described their encounters with Porter, the threats, the pressure, the underhanded tactics. He took notes, asked questions, and when they were finished, he sat back and folded his hands. This is good, he said. Very good. If we can get even half of this in front of a judge, Porter's finished. What do you need from us? Margaret asked. Written statements, documented evidence, anything that shows a pattern of harassment and fraud. He looked at Clara. And we'll need that survey map. That's our strongest piece. Clara nodded. You'll have it. Over the next 2 weeks, Kincaid built a case. He interviewed everyone Porter had ever tried to squeeze out, gathered land records, dug up old complaints that had been filed and mysteriously dismissed. The picture that emerged was damning. A man who'd spent years using money and intimidation to carve out an empire, one struggling ranch at a time. But building a case was one thing. Getting it in front of a judge was another. Porter had friends in high places. He'd been careful, covering his tracks, keeping his hands clean on paper. And when Kincaid filed the complaint with the territorial court, Porter's lawyers responded with a motion to dismiss. The hearing was set for early June. Clara spent the days leading up to it in a state of constant tension. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Ethan tried to reassure her, but she could see the worry in his face too. The night before the hearing, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars come out. What if we lose? Clara asked quietly. We won't. But what if we do? Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he said, Then we start over, somewhere else. Together. Clara looked at him. You do that? In a heartbeat. She felt her throat tighten. Ethan, Clara, I need to tell you something. He turned to face her, and in the dim light she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. I know this started as a business arrangement, a partnership, but somewhere along the way it became more than that. At least for me. Clara's heart was pounding. What are you saying? I'm saying I love you. I don't know when it happened, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but I needed you to know, before tomorrow, in case... Clara kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't graceful. She just leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, cutting off whatever he was about to say. For a moment he was too surprised to respond. Then his hand came up to cup her face, and he kissed her back. When they finally pulled apart, Clara was breathless. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now. I was just too stubborn to admit it. Ethan laughed, and the sound was full of relief and joy. We're quite a pair. Yeah, we are. They sat there for a long time, hands intertwined, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not uncertainty. Peace. Whatever happened tomorrow, they'd face it together. Mutts. The courtroom in Helena was small and stuffy, packed with people who'd come to see the showdown between Porter and the Alliance. Clara sat in the front row with Ethan, Margaret, and the others, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Porter sat across the aisle with his lawyers, looking confident and unbothered. He caught Clara's eye and smiled, and she had to force herself not to react. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Caldwell, called the court to order, and Kincaid stood to present the case. He was brilliant. He laid out the evidence methodically, calling witness after witness to describe Porter's tactics. John Garrett testified about threats he'd received. The Pruitts described how Porter had tried to sabotage their water supply. Daniel Cross brought receipts showing inflated prices from suppliers Porter controlled. And then Clara took the stand. Kincaid led her through her testimony carefully. She described arriving at the ranch, the financial struggles, Porter's attempts to buy them out. She talked about the false land claim and produced the survey map. Porter's lawyer tried to rattle her during cross-examination, suggesting she was inexperienced, that she didn't understand the complexities of land ownership, that she was making accusations based on speculation. Clara didn't flinch. "I understand perfectly well," she said. "Mr. Porter has been using fraud and intimidation to steal land from people who can't fight back. I have the documents to prove it, and I'm not backing down." The courtroom was silent. Porter's lawyer tried a few more questions, but Clara held firm. When she stepped down, she saw something flicker in Porter's expression. Not quite fear, but close. The hearing lasted 2 days. At the end of it, Judge Caldwell took a recess to review the evidence. Clara and the others waited outside, pacing, barely speaking. Ethan stood beside her, his hand on her back, and she leaned into him, drawing strength from his presence. After what felt like an eternity, they were called back in. Judge Caldwell looked out over the courtroom, her expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the evidence presented in this case," she said, "and I find the claims against Mr. Porter to be credible and substantiated." Clara's heart leapt. The false land claim against Silver Creek Valley Ranch is dismissed. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for potential criminal charges related to fraud and harassment. The courtroom erupted. Clara felt Ethan's arm around her, pulling her close, and she buried her face in his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. They'd won. Porter stood abruptly and walked out, his lawyers trailing behind him. Clara watched him go, and she felt no triumph, just exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, Margaret clapped her on the back. "You did it!" "We did it," Clara corrected. Kincaid shook her hand. "That was one hell of a testimony, Miss Wren." "Thank you." The Alliance celebrated that night at a tavern in Helena. They drank and laughed and toasted their victory, and for a few hours the weight of the past year lifted. But when Clara and Ethan finally left and started the long ride back to the ranch, the exhaustion set in. "You all right?" Ethan asked. Clara nodded. "Just tired. We can rest when we get home." Home. The words settled over her like a warm blanket. They rode in silence, and as the ranch came into view in the distance, Clara felt something shift inside her. This place, these people, this life she'd built from nothing, it was hers, truly hers, and she wasn't letting go. Summer unfolded slowly, warm and golden. The cattle fattened on the rich grass, the calves grew strong, and the ranch began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home. Porter disappeared. Rumor had it he'd sold off most of his land and left the territory, though no one knew for sure. Clara didn't care. He was gone, and that was enough. The alliance formalized into an official cooperative, with Margaret as the head and Clara managing the finances. They negotiated better prices, shared equipment, and supported each other through the challenges of ranching life. Clara and Ethan settled into a rhythm that felt natural, comfortable. They worked together during the day, sat together in the evenings, and somewhere along the way, Clara stopped thinking of herself as a temporary fixture and started thinking of herself as a partner in every sense of the word. One evening in late July, Ethan found her in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. He leaned against the doorframe, watching. "What?" Clara asked, glancing at him. "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" "About how lucky I am," Clara smiled. "Don't get sentimental on me, Whitlock." Too late. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Clara leaned back into him, her hands stilling in the dough. "I've been thinking too," she said. Yeah? About making this official, not just the partnership. Us. Ethan went still. Are you saying, I'm saying I want to marry you. For real. Not because we have to, but because I want to. Ethan turned her around to face him, his eyes searching hers. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He kissed her, slow and sweet, and when they pulled apart, he was smiling. So that's a yes? Clara asked. That's a hell yes. They were married in August in a small ceremony at the ranch with the Alliance members as witnesses. Margaret cried, which surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. Hank played a fiddle he'd dug out of storage, and Eli actually smiled. It wasn't fancy. There were no flowers, no elaborate decorations, just Clara in a simple dress she'd mended herself, Ethan in his cleanest shirt, and a justice of the peace who stumbled over half the vows because he was nervous. But it was perfect. That night, they stood on the porch together, looking out at the valley. The moon was full, casting silver light over the hills, and the air was warm and still. You know, Ethan said, when Samuel first told me he was writing to you, I thought he was crazy. I didn't think anyone would come. And if they did, I didn't think they'd stay. Shows what you know, Clara said. Yeah, it does. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you think he'd be proud of what we've done? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, I think he would be. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. The ranch still had problems, the work was still hard, and there would always be challenges ahead. But she wasn't facing them alone anymore. She had Ethan. She had the ranch. She had a community that had her back. And that was enough. Mati. Fall came with crisp air and the kind of light that turned everything golden. The cattle sale went better than expected, and Clara walked away with enough profit to pay down the loan, stock up for winter, and even set aside a little for emergencies. Carlson shook her hand when she made the payment. I have to admit, Miss Wren, Mrs. Whitlock, I should say, I didn't think you'd pull this off, but you proved me wrong. Good, Clara said. I like proving people wrong. Carlson laughed. I believe you do. Winter came again, as it always did, but this time it felt different. They were prepared. The hay was stacked high, the fences were solid, and the herd was strong. Clara and Ethan worked together seamlessly, and the crew, Hank and Eli, now joined by a young hand named Ben, functioned like a well-oiled machine. There were still hard days, days when the cold was brutal, when the work felt endless, when Clara wondered if they'd ever get ahead. But there were good days, too. Days when the sun broke through the clouds and the valley looked like something out of a painting. Days when the cattle were calm and the work went smoothly. Days when Clara and Ethan sat by the fire, exhausted but content, and talked about the future. One night in late December, Clara was looking over the books when she realized something. The ranch was finally turning a profit. Not much, but enough. She set down her pencil and just stared at the numbers, hardly daring to believe it. Ethan came in, covered in snow from checking on the cattle. He stomped his boots and looked at her. What's wrong? Nothing, We did it. Did what? Clara held up the ledger. We're in the black. For the first time since I got here, we're actually making money. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and looked at the numbers. His face broke into a grin. Clara, this is... I know. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and Clara clung to him, laughing too. When he set her down, she was breathless. We should celebrate, he said. With what? We just spent all our money paying bills. I don't care. We'll figure something out. They ended up making a simple dinner, roast chicken and potatoes, and eating it by the fire. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a feast. Afterward, Clara leaned back in her chair and looked at Ethan. Can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come? If you just let the ranch go? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, sometimes, and I think I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. Because of the ranch? Because of you. Clara felt her throat tighten. Ethan, I mean it. You saved me, Clara. Not just the ranch, me. I was drowning, and I didn't even know it. And then you showed up and you fought for this place like it was yours from the beginning. You gave me a reason to keep going." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "You did the same for me. I was so lost when I got here. I didn't know what I wanted or who I was or if I'd ever find a place where I belonged. But I found it. Here. With you." Ethan stood and pulled her to her feet. He kissed her, slow and tender, and Clara felt the truth of it settle into her bones. This was where she belonged, not because it was easy or perfect or anything like what she'd imagined when she stepped off that train, but because it was real, and because it was hers. Spring came again, as it always did, and with it, new life. The cattle calved, the grass greened, and the valley woke up from winter's grip. Clara stood on the porch one morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and she felt a sense of gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train in Copper Ridge all those months ago, angry, scared, desperate for something she couldn't name. That woman felt like a stranger now. Clara had changed. The ranch had changed her. Ethan had changed her, and she was better for it. Ethan came up behind her and wrapped an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. Just how far we've come." "We've got a long way to go yet." "I know, but I'm not scared anymore." "Me neither." They stood there together, watching the light spread across the valley, and Clara thought about the future. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. More hard winters, more financial struggles, more obstacles to overcome. But they'd face them together, and that made all the difference. Because the truth Clara had learned, the truth that had been beaten into her through months of exhaustion and struggle and small victories, was this: home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you built. Brick by brick, day by day, with your own two hands and the people who stood beside you. And she'd built hers. Silver Creek Valley Ranch wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. Not because everything had gone smoothly, or because they'd been lucky, or because some miracle had saved them, but because they'd fought for it. Because they'd refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against them. And because two people who'd started as strangers had become partners, and then friends, and then something deeper, a bond forged in hardship and tested by time. Clara turned to Ethan, and he looked down at her, his eyes warm and steady. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." And as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope she'd carried with her on that train, but something stronger, something earned. The hope that came from knowing you'd survive the worst and come out the other side. The hope that came from looking at what you'd built and knowing it was worth every sacrifice. The hope that came from finding exactly where you were meant to be. Clara and Ethan walked back into the house together, ready to face whatever the day would bring, because they were partners, they were family, and they were home.